For centuries, the history of deaf education has been a war between manualism and oralism. In the 1880s, oralism won, and sign language was banned from the classroom. It took almost 100 years for people to realise that pure oralism was not the success that was hoped for, when in the 1970s, a famous report showed that deaf children were leaving school at the age of 16, with a reading age of only 9 3/4. This sparked a new era of experiments to find a method that worked.
They tried experimenting with different methods. Until then, all deaf children had been taught in the same way. So, you had the cued speech faction, the Paget-Gorman faction, the SEE, Signing Exact English group, and so on, all teaching in different ways. The result was that when deaf children left school and met up, they couldn't understand each other.
To put it in very simple terms, we don't know yet how deaf children really think.
I think for a long time we thought we couldn't give children geography because geographic ideas are difficult, like the idea of distance and how other people live and so forth, are too hard for them. I think for too long we have said because they're deaf we can't give them these things, we just give them language. But it's no good giving them language that doesn't have experience with it.
In the quest to find the best method, many organisations became involved. The BDA began a campaign for the use of sign language to be returned to the classroom.
Psychologists and psychiatrists working with deaf people are all convinced that total communication must be employed from a very early age by deaf children and their parents if untold harm is not to be done.
Story called The Hare and the Tortoise.
The deaf person should be free to use all the communication methods that he finds useful for his purposes.
By the mid-1970s, the government called for an official report to decide on the way forward for educating disabled children. The report would have a dramatic effect. It was the Warnock Report.
The time that we were meeting, that is between 1974 and 1978, when the report came out, there was such battle lines drawn that it was really an incredibly difficult subject to tackle. In general, our conclusion was that we must do away, as far as we can, with categories and think of not what was wrong with the child, but what the child would need if she was going to flourish and get educated at whatever level.
The Warnock Report concerned itself with trying to see if mainstreaming would give the opportunity for some education to any child, regardless of level. That was the purpose of the Warnock Report. This should have been done by determining their educational needs and developing provision accordingly.
For the first time, deaf children were being taught the national curriculum and being taught not only in schools for the deaf, but in mainstream schools too.
I was one of the first to be mainstreamed all the way through my school life. I didn't go to a deaf school and I had no support at all.
Mainstreaming overall is positive for education and for work opportunities. However, I'd say socially it failed me.
I found it really difficult. The first few months were really horrible. I was bullied.
I've always been to mainstream school and I've had no problems. I've seen the difference between a profoundly deaf school and a mainstream school, but I've had no problems with it. Really, I was used to it. Sometimes I have difficulties communicating with hearing people, but most of the time it's fine, normal.
At lunchtime and break times, I hadn't a clue what was going on. I'd follow people around and try to fit in with a group. It was fine when I was at primary school, because I could join in the skipping and games. But as I got older, the kids would all chat with each other.
Currently, over 90% of deaf children are in mainstream schools, but is this successful? There is very little research, but one study from the Auralist Ewing Foundation in 1998 found some evidence of children taught orally who could thrive in a mainstream environment.
When we had a look at them and had a look at their achievements, so at school leaving age, when they'd just gone into college, those children had exactly the same, in fact slightly better achievements in terms of GCSEs than the published data for hearing children at the time.
A recent study by the NDCS found that the standard of deaf education in mainstream schools is still lagging way behind that of hearing pupils.
At the moment, 65% of deaf children are not getting 5 A to C GCSEs, compared with 34% of their hearing peers. That's not acceptable.
Deafness isn't a learning disability. After 400 years of deaf education, some places appear to be getting it right, but others are still struggling.
Okay, so you've seen the blue stuff go white, and you've made water. It's condensing, so it's making condensation. Say that for me. Say that for me. Condensation. Condensation. Good.
Our children come at the age of 11 to the secondary school with language deficits. So we've always had an approach at looking beyond the language difficulties and trying to see what potential the child has, not what their current level of functioning linguistically is.
There's 3 units, and we're going to look at Unit 1 first. I'm not going to bombard you with loads of information today. I'm just going to talk about Unit 1.
The mandatory qualification, this qualification that we run on behalf of Oxford Brookes, makes a statement. If you're going to get it right for a deaf child, you've got to be educated at master's level to be able to look into the needs of deaf children and get it right.
Every Monday it's going to be the language lesson when we have the speech and language therapist coming.
There's a huge variation in the amount of support that deaf children are receiving from local authorities. One example is an area that has 100 children receiving support from just one teacher of the deaf, while another has 47 pupils. The support is so variable. We want and demand that the government investigate this and make sure the support is fair, and that it doesn't matter where the children live, but that they receive the same high-quality support.
Is it clean? That's dirty!
The challenges for me centre around the training of teachers of the deaf, the numbers of teachers of the deaf, and the huge variability in the numbers of teachers of the deaf, even within in a particular area. So we've got a shortage of teachers of the deaf.
One teacher of the deaf, 30 deaf children. So over 1 week, that's a maximum of, 1 hour? And that's if it's the same place. If the teacher has to travel, then you might have half an hour a week, or 1 hour every 2 weeks. It's madness.
The desperate shortage of teachers of the deaf means that the majority of deaf children in mainstream schools are taught by a mainstream teacher through the support of a communication support worker, a CSW.
Most of the time now he can access everything and he's fine with it, but there are times when he gets so tired from looking at the transliteration and processing all the information, or if the children are particularly noisy in the class, he'll just say to me, I am really tired, I can't do any more. And it's those times when you've got to be really sensitive to what his needs are. I personally think it's about lack of training, and I think it's about a lack of understanding about what children need. I think it's a lack of understanding that deaf children can achieve, and that you can expect high things of them. I think there is a tendency for people to think that they're stupid and that they can't achieve as much.
The DESF, Deaf Education Support Forum, undertook a survey in 2010 in which they interviewed 230 CSWs and interpreters working in education, and only 25 had the relevant BTEC qualification. The others didn't.
Many CSWs don't really have enough understanding of how children learn, how they learn language, how they learn in school. And because they are a really important person in helping that child to learn, they need to have that knowledge.
The CSW needs a high level of deaf awareness, but so does the mainstream teacher to ensure that deaf children are fully included in the mainstream classroom.
So in your groups together, if you can sort these out into ones you have heard of and ones that you haven't heard of. Okay? What types haven't you heard of? We've all heard of it.
What needs to happen is for the teacher to stop and give me a chance to explain. But if they do that, the hearing children will be waiting around.
Sorry. Thank you. Yeah, sorry.
We asked her to slow down, and that really helped. I learnt a lot. But when there was a lot going on, some of it went over my head.
At lunch or break times, we go through things with them, but hearing children are outside getting fresh air and a proper lunch break, while deaf children are indoors with their teacher. I don't think that's fair.
Worryingly, children in a mainstream setting often seem to be missing some parts of the curriculum.
Could everybody just stop? Because I want to ask Dylan and Jake and Ryan to maybe read a little bit of their poem.
Sit nicely on the chair properly then.
Okay.
Fasten seashells on your ear. Listen. Amazing was what me
here. The curriculum doesn't stop for them, it just carries on. So yes, it is difficult to fit everything in. For some of the deaf children, we pare it down and we say, right, I think we'll do that part, and that part. That's going to be the bit that is important for them to learn.
What are each of these 4 lines? What are they called? Verses. Okay, verses. So each of these is a verse. We're going to read the first verse together. Okay, ready?
It's really important that deaf children do the same curriculum as hearing children, so they can have the same qualifications. The curriculum must be the same. It's about ensuring the curriculum is accessible to deaf children and that the teacher knows how to support them properly in the mainstream environment.
I have a high level of literacy. This is mainly due to the expectations in my mainstream school. These were very high. I had to work really hard to meet these standards, so there was a lot of pressure, and the expectation of the teachers was that I would do the same as the others. I didn't follow a lot of what was going on in class, so it meant that I had to do a lot more work at home. I had the support from my family, which meant that I was able to keep up with my hearing peers.
The majority of deaf teachers are in deaf schools, but the trend for closing deaf schools continues.
To take away one part of deaf provision that's currently achieving very high standards, very high rates of progress, has a very successful Ofsted, is very short-sighted of the local authority.
We are aware of the fact that parents very often with lots of special schools would like inclusion if it is done properly.
The issue for us is not anything to do with the inclusion aspect of it. It's to do with how that's led, managed, focused and driven.
At the moment there are local authorities cutbacks which are cutting back some services even further, even though services for deaf children are mandatory. And some of that's about people not really understanding that simply because children have the technology, that does not mean that they're now hearing children.
Everything that we see about children who come to us later suggests that children are being pushed into oral fields of education rather than into signing fields of education, and sometimes this is not the right thing for them. We quite often pick up on children who've been placed in other provisions where it is mainly oral, who have developed no language at all.
We talk about access to education, and I think it's really important that we make a very clear distinction between access to teaching and learning, which is only one aspect, one element of education, and access to the assessment arrangements. And I would have no quibble that through sign language, access to the teaching and learning can take place.
My mum asked me if I wanted a signing or oral education. I love sign language, but my mum explained that a good education gives you more opportunities. I had to think not just about sign language, but what I wanted for my future.
That unless you have the development of English through the education of the deaf child, they're going to get access to teaching and learning, but then they're going to fall short when they're called upon to gain the credit for that.
The choice of sending a child to a mainstream or deaf school is usually a decision made by parents. But with limited information available, are they making choices that are fully informed?
When we give parents information, we would like to give them all the information, but at the point of diagnosis, they're not always ready to receive too much. So we drip feed, if you like, information in, but when we do that, we are clear with parents that we probably talk about auditory oral approach to education, and there are other approaches, and if parents want to find out about those, we will work with them to do that.
You can only make an informed choice if you know where to go for the information, and I don't think that there's enough of a profile about the services for deaf children.
Where do I start? I mean, the consultants, they don't know anything about being deaf. So forget about the consultants. The doctors, what would they know? That's what I say now. I can go and tell them, look, my son is deaf. They said yes. That's about it.
In this country, we have a system in special educational needs that is committed to meeting individual need. That's what the law says, that's what the literacy says. But the reality is that often the amount of support you get is not determined by your need, it's determined by a policy.
We don't give the equal choice because when new diagnosis, our first information is about hearing, hearing aids, cochlear implants. That is our first information. But if parents want something else, then we would work in partnership with them. So.
This is the way we walk to school, walk to school, walk to school. This is the way we walk to school on a warm and sunny morning.
Deaf schools and mainstream schools should carry out a full diagnostic assessment in order to map out an appropriate pathway for a child. So often, the wrong pathway is followed, causing delays in development, and by the time this is realised, it's too late.
If a child was profoundly deaf, I'd say put them in a deaf school or a mainstream school. If when they get older and they wanted to move, I'd say go for mainstream. Because a mainstream school gives you more opportunities for the future. And you know how to communicate with hearing people. It gives you more of a chance. You get more used to it. Deaf schools are good, they're more deaf pupils, but how are they going to cope in the future?
To communicate my best answer, it's better for me to sign. Oralism is fine, but when I speak and people don't understand me, it's frustrating.
I feel the life opportunities have been good for me. I went to college, which helped my career, and I do now have a good job, and the salary's okay.
There's been hardly any independent research into mainstreaming. Who designed the research? Hearing people. Who conducted the research? Hearing people. Who asked the questions? Hearing again, and so it goes on. I'm not anti-hearing, that's not the point. The point is, where is the involvement of deaf people?
I feel very strongly, and have for some time, that the present framework that followed from our report has had its day. So I think we're in a state of crisis, and I think we need to start all over again from the beginning. I would have thought that common sense ought to prevail here rather than dogmatism, if that's possible. Though I know that the history of the education of the deaf has been bedeviled by dogmatism right from the start.
It's clear it's time for a new Royal Commission to look at the future of deaf education. But this time it should be founded on hard evidence, and the experience of deaf people should be central to its conclusions. If deaf children are going to truly fulfil their potential, then there's an urgent need to learn from past mistakes.